Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. This is the account with the news summary for day 384 of the war in Ukraine. Before we start, I wanted to thank you all for your continued support and all the comments you leave me. While I read all of them, I sadly barely find the time to respond to all of them in a timely manner. Thank you. Today's report is rather long, as there has been quite a bit to report on. I have 2 articles I want to point out and 1 extra segment regarding the Reaper drone incident over the Black Sea. All other updates are grouped into the usual situation inside Ukraine, including an update about the dismissal of 3 administration heads, the occupied territories, with reports of the latest assassination attempts by the partisans, Russia and Belarus, containing a story about unidentified drones flying around Moscow, and the international developments. But before we start, the flashpoints along the front. Donbas. From Kupiansk in the northern Kyiv Oblast to Avdiivka in the south, through Bakhmut, Liman, and dozens of towns in between, Russian forces are attacking along a 257-kilometer arc in eastern Ukraine. Russian gains are minimal, and they come at a frightful cost on both sides. Western officials and analysts have estimated at least 200,000 dead or injured on the Russian side. Donetsk Oblast. The spokesman of the defense forces of the Tavria region, Oleksiy Dmitrashkivsky, stated today that Russia has significantly reduced the number of assaults and shelling compared to last week. Where defenders had to repel 100 assaults a day, currently they are facing only 30 assaults. According to him, the Russian offensive has culminated. Kupiansk. Russia has lately increased its attacks in this area. One of their goals is to push Ukraine out of the bridgehead they hold here. Oleksiy Nyehubov, the head of the Kyiv Regional Military Administration, reported that Russia has started assaulting Ukrainian positions in Kyiv. Bakhmut. Heavy fighting continues in and around Bakhmut. Wagner forces managed to capture parts of the Azov metal plant industrial zone. Wagner has published photos today showing its mercenaries in the same location where President Zelensky met with defenders of Bakhmut in December 2022. The President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, convened a meeting of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief staff today. The defense on the Bakhmut front was discussed, and everyone agreed that the defense of Bakhmut will continue. After the meeting, Valery Zaluzhny, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, stated that he believes that the defense of the city of Bakhmut holds back Russians and is key to the stability of the entire front. Avdiivka. The situation in and around Krasnohorivka still remains unclear. A video shared yesterday shows Ukrainian forces attacking along the road east of Krasnohorivka. Due to sensitive content, I will not share the video, but it has been geolocated to this area here. Vuhledar. Ukraine repelled several Russian assaults on the settlement. Russia reportedly took heavy casualties during the assaults and lost a large amount of vehicles. A video I do not want to share due to sensitive content shows a Russian BTR-82A after it allegedly ran over a mine. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine published this photo, which allegedly shows the diary entries of a Russian officer captured near Vuhledar. The entries read, March 1st, 100 soldiers undertook an assault, 16 remained. March 3rd, out of 116 soldiers, 23 remained. March 4th, out of 103 soldiers, 15 remained. March 5th, out of 115 soldiers, 3 remained. And before we start the news segment, a look at today's special occasion. Today is the Ukrainian Military Volunteer Day. General Valery Zaluzhny, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, has praised the volunteers that rose to defend Ukraine against the Russian invasion. "A nation of military volunteers is invincible," he stated. And now for the first article I want to point out. The Kyiv Independent has published its weekly investigative stories from Ukraine newsletter, highlighting the most prominent investigations of the past week. Bihus.info finds another defense ministry contract with inflated food prices. Slitstvo.info, Russia labels its killed soldiers missing to avoid compensating families. General Media, Russia widens range of people subject to travel restrictions. The second article I wanted to point out is titled "The 4-meter-wide board detailing the entire Russian military chain of command in Ukraine." A prosecutor of Ukraine showed the Guardian journalists a chart used to map hundreds of Russian soldiers all the way up to Vladimir Putin. The chart contains some 600 people from the military and political command of the Russian Federation under suspicion for war crimes. I recommend reading this article. And to start the news segment, the updates on the Reaper drone incident. It was reported that an incident involving a US Air Force MQ-9 Reaper drone has occurred over the Black Sea. There are some reports that the drone has been shot down. However, an investigation is currently ongoing. Later it was reported that a Russian fighter jet collided with the US MQ-9 Reaper drone over the Black Sea, forcing it down. US Air Force General James B. Hecker stated, "At approximately 7:03 a.m. CET, one of the Russian Su-27 aircraft struck the propeller of the MQ-9, causing US forces to have to bring the MQ-9 down in international waters. Several times before the collision, the Su-27 dumped fuel on and flew in front of the MQ-9 in a reckless, environmentally unsound and unprofessional manner. This incident demonstrates a lack of competence in addition to being unsafe and unprofessional." The Russian Ministry of Defense meanwhile commented, "On the morning of March 14th this year, over the Black Sea in the region of the Crimean Peninsula, the airspace control of the Russian Aerospace Forces recorded the flight of an American MQ-9 unmanned aerial vehicle in the direction of the state border of the Russian Federation. The drone, as a result of sharp maneuvering, went into uncontrolled flight with the loss of altitude and collided with the water surface. Russian fighters did not use airborne weapons, they did not come into contact with an unmanned aerial vehicle, and safely returned to their base airfield." The BBC has a live ticker with more information on the situation. A look at all the minor updates out of Ukraine. Authorities in Kyiv have decided to dismantle barriers, fill up trenches and remove checkpoints as there currently is a minimal risk for a renewed attack on the capital by Russia. In the morning, Russia launched a missile strike on Odesa Oblast using Su-24 tactical aircraft. 4 anti-radar missiles, presumably Kh-31s, were fired from the Black Sea towards the coast. Ukrainian soldiers are undergoing psychological resilience training in northern Ukraine. Ukrainian prosecutors have accused 2 Russian soldiers of sexually abusing a 4-year-old girl and gang-raping her mother at gunpoint in front of her father during the occupation in the Brovary district of Kyiv Oblast. The Cabinet of Ministers has dismissed the following people: Serhiy Haidai, head of the Luhansk Oblast State Administration; Maxim Marchenko, head of the Odesa Oblast State Administration; Serhiy Hamali, the head of the Khmelnytsky Oblast State Administration. A Russian agent who served in the militia of the so-called Luhansk People's Republic and was tasked with assassinating Ukrainian citizens, including Ukraine's defense minister and defense intelligence chief, on the orders of the Russian Special Services, has been sentenced to up to 12 years in prison. Next up, the latest regarding the situation in the occupied territories. The Russian occupation authorities in the city of Avdiivka, Zaporizhia Oblast, have devised a plan to evacuate the staff of the occupation administration and their families to Crimea in an attempt to quell the panic spreading among those who collaborated with the Russian regime. Meanwhile, Ukraine's Southern Command spokesperson Natalia Humenyuk said that another gesture of goodwill is being prepared as Moscow installed proxies on the east bank of Kherson Oblast prepare to leave the Russian-occupied territories, taking away documentation and looting things. The Artesh resistance movement has made a second attempt on the life of Vitaly Hura, the Russian-appointed deputy head of administration of occupied Nova Kakhovka in Kherson Oblast. An explosive device was set off next to a car belonging to Hura. Russian media outlet Baza reported that Hura was injured. The Russian occupiers are increasingly handing out summonses in cities of temporarily occupied Crimea. In occupied Melitopol, a car bomb killed the Russian collaborator Ivan Tkach. Moving on to the news updates from Russia and Belarus. Russia has managed to accumulate about a third of its revenues from the sale of raw materials outside the country during the year of the full-scale war. This could be one of the targets for new Western sanctions. Bloomberg's economic analysts suggest that these funds, totaling about $80 billion, are scattered across holdings of cash, property, and investments in affiliates abroad. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has instructed Russia's largest holding company for the production of various types of missiles to double its production. Over the past days, residents in Moscow and Moscow Oblast have reported unidentified drones circling over their homes and infrastructure objects. Initially, the called police could not find the drones or the drone operators. During another incident, Russian National Guard officers managed to identify two UAV operators who claimed they were filming for personal purposes. Vladimir Putin, president of the Russian Federation, visited an aircraft factory in Ulan-Ude and once again told the workers that the West had deceived him, which led to the start of the war against Ukraine. The press secretary of the president of Russia, Dmitry Peskov, stated on the topic of possible prosecution and cases against Russians accused of war crimes in Ukraine at the International Criminal Court in The Hague that Russia does not recognize this court nor the jurisdiction of this court. Peskov, in order to undermine and discredit any international organization, repeated the Kremlin's propaganda of a genocide being waged against the people of the Donbas. The authorities of Donetsk Oblast have started to distribute military draft notices. This, allegedly, is in order to update the military record data. Russia currently has 4 missile carriers on active combat duty in the Black Sea. The total salvo is 28 missiles. And to wrap up the news segment, the international developments. According to the Polish Prime Minister, Poland could transfer MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine within the next 4 to 6 weeks. At the press conference, journalists asked when the fighters will be provided to Ukraine. The Prime Minister responded that it may happen in April. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is one of the possible US Republican presidential candidates, has said that protecting Ukraine from the Russian invasion is not a vital US interest. US Vice President in Donald Trump's administration and possible Republican presidential candidate Mike Pence criticized opponents of aid to Ukraine in his political ranks. According to him, the Republican Party has no place for Putin apologists. Victory of Ukraine in the war is necessary. Pence said that he does not support a blank check for aid to Ukraine, but the refusal of support or its reduction will have far-reaching consequences and a much higher price. The EU Council adopted a decision about increasing the financial ceiling of the European Peace Facility, which allocates funds to purchase armaments for Ukraine. The fund is set to increase to €7.979 billion by 2027, which will cover additional financial needs. The Rheinmetall concern, one of the largest manufacturers of military equipment and weapons in Europe, said that the European defense industry will not be able to meet the needs of the Ukrainian defense forces for artillery ammunition of the caliber 155 mm for the war of liberation against Russia, unless the Allied governments allocate enough money to double the capacity. A new ammunition gunpowder production plant will be built in Romania, as well as manufacturing lines for the production of ammunition. This is to be done in cooperation with the US and South Korea, the Minister of Economy of Romania, Florin Spataru, announced. Fighters of the Polish Special Forces guarded the oligarch Roman Abramovich, who acted as a mediator in the Ukrainian-Russian negotiations in the first weeks of the full-scale war, and also guaranteed the safety of representatives of Ukraine at the negotiations in Brest, Belarus, in late February and early March 2022. And now for the intelligence report segment, starting as usual with the UK Ministry of Defence. In recent weeks, Russian artillery ammunition shortages have likely worsened to the extent that extremely punitive shell rationing is in force on many parts of the front. This has almost certainly been a key reason why no Russian formation has recently been able to generate operationally significant offensive action. Russia has almost certainly already resorted to issuing old munitions stock, which were previously categorized as unfit for use. A presidential decree of March 3, 2023, laid down measures for the Ministry of Trade and Industry to bypass the authority of the managers of defense industries who fail to meet their production goals. Russia is increasingly applying the principles of a command economy to its military-industrial complex because it recognizes that its defense manufacturing capacity is a key vulnerability in the increasingly attritional special military operation. A look at the latest assessment by the Institute for the Study of War. The Russian political scientist Alexei Mukhin commented on remarks made by Yevgeny Prigozhin, in which he announced his desire to run for the office of the President of Ukraine in 2024. Mukhin said on his Telegram channel that the Russian public began to interpret Prigozhin's statement as an announcement that he will run for the Russian presidential elections, also scheduled for 2024. The political scientist also rhetorically asked if Prigozhin notified Russian President Vladimir Putin about his presidential ambitions. Mukhin further argued that Prigozhin's presentation of himself as the commander of the Wagner private military company directly affects the planning and management of the assault squad's combat operations. This is in line with the Institute's assessment that the Russian Ministry of Defense may be deliberately expanding Wagner forces in Bakhmut, in part to derail Prigozhin's political aspirations. Mukhin's accusations also support the assessment that the Russian leadership could be attempting to blame Prigozhin for the slowed pace of advance in Bakhmut and for high casualties among Wagner mercenaries. This also showcases how the Kremlin may perceive Prigozhin's controversial statements and his threat to Putin's regime. The researchers previously observed harsh criticism towards Prigozhin from military bloggers, such as disgraced Russian officer Igor Girkin, but Mukhin's statement is notable because of his existing affiliation with the Kremlin-affiliated Valdai Discussion Club. The researchers made further assessments on the following minor topics. Chechen Republic head Ramzan Kadyrov continues efforts to maintain Chechnyas relevance in the Russian political and military sphere. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko met with Iranian officials in Tehran on March 13th to expand bilateral cooperation and bolster sanctions mitigations. Russian mill bloggers continue to speculate about prospective Ukrainian counteroffensives in southern Ukraine, suggesting increasing concern in the Russian information space about Ukrainian combat capabilities as Russian forces pin themselves on offensive operations in Bakhmut. A Russian State Duma bill aiming to raise the conscription age suggests that the Kremlin is not planning to conduct full mobilization in the future. The Russian military is reporting employing the newly created assault detachments in different manners across different tactical situations. Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Reintegration of Temporarily Occupied Territories of Ukraine, Irina Vereshchuk, confirmed that Russia has illegally deported 2,161 Ukrainian orphans to Russia. And to wrap up the report, the evening update by the General Staff of Ukraine. The Russian aggressor concentrates his main efforts on conducting offensive operations in the Liman, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Marinka, and Shachtarska directions. The enemy does not stop trying to enter the administrative border of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasts. In the Kupiansk and Liman directions, during the current day, the enemy unsuccessfully tried to break through the defense of our troops. In the Bakhmut direction, the enemy does not stop trying to capture the city of Bakhmut, where constant positional battles continue. At the same time, our defenders repelled enemy attacks in the areas of Yahidne, Hromove, and Orihovo-Vasiliivka settlements. In the Avdiivka, Marinka, and Shachtarska directions, the enemy carried out unsuccessful offensive actions in the direction of the settlements of Kamyanka, Nevelske, Novokalinove, and Marinka. The enemy is defending in the Zaporizhia and Kherson directions. Over the past day, the enemy, with the active support of the local occupying so-called authorities, carried out filtering measures against the local population in the settlement of Abrikosivka in the temporarily occupied territory of the Kherson Oblast. The reason for the searches of private houses, inspection of mobile communication devices, personal laptops and computers was the attack by the Defense Forces of Ukraine on the base of one of the units of the Russian army. As a result, 4 units of armored vehicles and at least 15 occupants were completely destroyed. The number of wounded is being checked and clarified. Over the past few days, an additional 1,000 enemy soldiers have been stationed on the territory of coastal camping sites and boarding houses in the city of Yalta, Donetsk Oblast. In this regard, the nearest streets and the entire beach area were completely closed, additional roadblocks were placed, and the number of foot patrols was doubled. The equipment of engineering barriers and trenches and dugouts was noticed on the territory of the recreation bases in the immediate vicinity of the occupiers' bases. Also, the number of training firings from various types of weapons in the direction of the sea has been increased. And that concludes today's report. If you're interested in any of the articles and want to read up on them in detail, you can find links to them in the description. If you enjoyed the report and found it informative, please consider sharing it with others and giving me a like. I hope you will join me again tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in and have a great day. You were listening to The Account. Slava Ukraini.